And one of the things I think that we brought to the table was I had to figure out how to understand it. How can I make complex ideas simple? So we had to make things like the wall of time. We tried to take the information of history and put it so you could visually see it. The other thing we did is we looked at it and we created the technique of calling it patterns of evidence. What are the patterns that match? What does the narrative of the Bible say? It says they arrived. It says they multiplied. It says they were enslaved. Those are three ideas that each represent a pattern. Can we find...
And you can check them archaeologically. That's the important thing. These are things you can actually look in the ground for.
Right.
You can't find miracles with archaeology, but you can find evidence like that. Arrival of a Semitic group of people, their multiplication to this 30,000 people city, and then their enslavement. You can see that evidence in the ground, and that's the most important thing about being able to work with the archaeology and this pattern.
Yeah. So we identified 6 major patterns, and that's the technique that Patterns was looking for, was where can we find the sequence of 6 major patterns in the archaeology, and that was a breakthrough. Because I think then the average person, which is myself, can understand it, and then we could visually communicate so that every word was defined. And so that I have had 8, 9, 10-year-old children that watch the film, and they get it. They understand, and they're talking about things that normally no one would ever be able to, because it's been never defined. It hasn't been visual. And so what has been, I think, the breakthrough with Patterns is that it says the Bible says this. So the Bible is the key. We let the Bible for the first time, I think, in a long time, speak for itself. And then we say, well, let's go talk to the different opinions, and let's then see where the evidence is. And what you start seeing in the film as it unfolds, and as well as the books that we've produced, is that the Bible then starts to reveal itself in the archaeology. Or vice versa. The archaeology reveals that the Bible, what it said, is actually there. And that's the big breakthrough, I think, for many people, because they're seeing the Bible come to life, where for the last 50, 60 years, people said, we can't find the evidence for it, it must be false.
Well, I can understand your motivation to be involved in the project in terms of a crisis of faith, but for you, David, as a self-described agnostic, the motivation is a little less clear or obvious. First of all, what do you mean when you say you're an agnostic?
Well, I understand the word to mean not knowing. In other words, not being sure of anything at this stage in terms of faith. As a historian, I'm looking for truth. That's the simple fact of it. When I look into the past, when I look to the archaeological evidence and the historical evidence for the period before the birth of Christ, I am in search of facts. I'm in search of truth. And I can't see why we have to treat the Bible any differently to any other ancient document in the world. Why do we separate it from the text of Ramesses II or Homer or Herodotus? We should treat them, all these documents, with equal scrutiny. And somehow or other, scholars have decided the Bible is not part of that process, that they can't use it to investigate the past. I don't see it that way. I test out the biblical text as you would any other ancient text and treat it the same way. And I find evidence for the events that are described in Genesis and the story of Exodus all the way through to the conquest. I even find evidence in the United Monarchy of Kings and Chronicles. So if I find the evidence for the historical events, that, as far as I'm concerned, is fact. That becomes real history, genuine history. And then if that supports people's faith foundation, if it's the foundation for faith because you have a real historical basis for the text and the narrative, then I think that's a great thing. And I can offer that as an agnostic to the faith community and say, here is the evidence that we now have for the biblical stories, for those events, for those people, their personalities. And if it's reinforcing to your faith, that's a wonderful thing. But what it also does, it enables us to counter all the negativity there is in scholarship and secular scholarship today, which says the Bible's a fairy story. The Bible's Harry Potter. It's no more than that. How can you base your faith on Harry Potter? So I'm saying you can base your faith on real, genuine events that have occurred that we now see in the archaeology that match the biblical story. So that's where I'm coming from.
So how is it that you, even as an agnostic, can accept the Bible as historical documentation, and many of your colleagues in the field would not start with that assumption?
Well, that's true. And also you find that there are men of faith in my disciplines who now reject the biblical story as historical. They say it's a moral story. It's a story about how you should live your life, but the historical parts of it aren't real. And I can't deal with that. I say they have to be real. The foundation of the story of Exodus is behind everything. It's behind the Passover celebrations that the Jewish faith have had for 4,000 years. It's the foundation of three major religions. You can't suddenly turn around and say, no, that happened. So, it has to have happened. And I find it difficult that men of faith are not prepared to look at this alternative way of looking at the stories in relationship to archaeology by a simple shift in the Egyptian timeline. It's not that much to ask them to do, but we are having resistance from some areas of biblical scholarship within the academic community.
I think that it's a good question, which, as far as this question of what is the definition of an agnostic? It's someone who has questions. And I started realizing that there's probably a lot more people that have questions, but they've never really publicly said, I'm an agnostic. But they're actually acting like one in their actions. In other words, they don't necessarily act like they believe it. And so if this really is true, do you take it in? Do you actually live by it? Or do you still act as if you still have questions about it and you're not fully committed? And I think the questions that we've had, I think the relationship, because I've tried to have a dialogue with the world, and that means people that are on all spectrums, and that's what Patterns does. I think the goal of Patterns of Evidence is to let the Bible be there, let it stand for itself, but then bring the archaeology and different elements and see where things happen. And the tremendous reality, I think, in my mind, is that it's actually standing up to the test. And I think that then there are other questions of faith that go deeper for people like David and others to say, well, then what else do I need to deal with? What other questions do I have? And I think that questions are okay. It's the fact that we don't face them is when it gets to be a problem. And so I'm hoping that Patterns of Evidence helps to answer some of the questions for people, number one. And number two, I think it helps to encourage people of faith that there is a historical basis here that is lining up very well, probably better than a lot of other things in history. And just because people don't acknowledge it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
So it's sort of an apologetic motivation then, in a sense, in terms of your hoped for outcome of the viewers of the film.
I think so. I mean, I'm a person of faith, but I'm a filmmaker, and I've tried to be as objective as possible. Some people said I've given halfway through the film, they didn't know which way it was going. I've tried to give, I know you could probably speak to this, but I've tried to give the other viewpoints their due. Because at the end of the day, I want to know what the truth is. And I've been asked that question, well, why did you do this? Why did you do this? And I have to say, because I want to know what the truth is. I talked to Dr. Walt Kaiser, who is a very well-known theologian. He was a part of the Biblical Archaeology Bible for Zondervan. And he said, if this isn't true, then why put up with the sham? He says, your kids and grandkids will say, come on, Pops, why are you doing this? But if it is true, then we had a line we used to use, it changes everything. Because then we have a historical faith. And I loved it. David brought up this he says the Testament, we call it Old Testament, it's a testimony. So what we have is eyewitness testimonies that certain things happen, and they've been passed down to us by these different writers, and many believe, inspired by the Holy Spirit. So if this is true, a testimony, then interpreting it in a way that says, well, it doesn't really matter if it happened or not. That's the conflict right now in the culture. And I didn't know that I would be doing this, but I can see that it's a very valid and engaging, and the evidence is there. We're sitting on a lot more evidence that we haven't, because we just have to make the next films.
So did the making of this film answer your own crisis of faith?
I would say yes, absolutely. I think that a lot of my life, I would have probably been one of those people that would have become an agnostic, but not publicly, privately, to have these amazing questions. And to be honest with you, I think that there's a temptation for people to move away from faith because they don't have an answer. And I think this question of faith and reason, we could talk about that for a minute. I really think that there are many people that need more than just believe and let's go get a bite of pizza. There are people that they were created with a thinking mind. That's why I created this company called Thinking Man Films and Media, for the films and the books, because I think it's actually, they can't be separated. You have to have both. And there are times, Dr. Walt Kaiser said that, he said to me, or said to us in the interview, there are times when you don't have an answer, just put that pot on the back burner and let it simmer for a while and come back to it later on. It doesn't mean that you throw it out. It's just that there are certain answers to questions that aren't there yet. But that doesn't mean that your overall faith has to be injured because of that. But there are many people that have questions and they just need some answers. And by talking about it with others, there could be very, very good answers for these things.
And I would say from an archaeologist's standpoint, you have to realize that when we look at the Middle East, the Levant and Egypt, we've only actually excavated 10% of what's there. There's 90% more to come in the future. So we're not going to have all the answers right away. It's going to take decades, generations before we actually know everything in terms of the archaeology of that region. So at the moment we only know 10%, and already we found all this fantastic material. What are we going to find in the next 20 or 30 or 40 years? So it's a fascinating ongoing process. It doesn't stop with this first film. It's ongoing. It will go on through the generations.
The interesting shift in that regard is that probably previous to the 19th century, the assumption was the biblical accounts were true, and then you use the archaeological evidence to verify it or in some case raise in question. Over the last 200 years, that shift the Bible isn't true unless there's archaeological evidence that actually says it is true.
It began with Kathleen Kenny's excavation of Jericho. That's where the question started to rise, because when she excavated the site of Tel Es Sultan, which is the Jericho mound, she found absolutely no city there for 600 years, right in the time period when Ramesses was the king and when Moses was supposed to have brought the Israelites out of there and Joshua was supposed to have destroyed Jericho. There was no Jericho to destroy. So that's where the doubt started there. And what we've done is simply said, okay, let's go back to the Jericho that was destroyed. We know there is one. It's the one that was destroyed before the 600-year lacuna. And let's look at that. And that fits exactly in with the pattern we've been talking about here, where you have this large population of Semites in Egypt. They suddenly disappear from that place, and then Jericho is destroyed a few decades later. It fits the story perfectly. So instead of getting all tied up with this idea that Ramesses is the Pharaoh of Exodus and then finding no evidence for Jericho, no evidence for the Exodus in that time, let's go to the time when Jericho was destroyed and look from there. And then it all fits together.
And it's hard. I mean, I think there are really good scholars, really good people of faith that and other scholars that have completely different opinions. So the hope and the idea behind patterns is to have this dialogue, is to say, okay, all right, let's talk about it. What is your reasoning for your position? Lay it down there in the court of ideas, as it were. And Mansour Barayak, Egyptologist and Egyptian, he basically said some amazing things in the film. He said, let the people decide, Are you, do you have some idea in your own head? I mean, he couldn't have said it better, but, we have a myth, we have history, lay it out there. And that's what basically we did. And that's what we're going to continue to do. The idea is that this is the next film that we're working on is about the route. And, but not so much just about the route, because the route, there's no theological benefit to which way did they go. It's what happened at the mountain that is really important. What was given at the mountain. So the next film will have amazing information about the alternative routes and the crossing sites and the mountains. But it's going to also have amazing revelation about what was given at the mountain. And I think that's really what was the lasting effect. That's what shaped Western civilization and shaped our world. That was when God revealed himself. He actually spoke to people at Mount Sinai. And I said one time in Jerusalem when I was being filmed, I said, God called the Jewish people to reveal who he was to the world. But first, he would reveal who he was to them at Mount Sinai. And that is where we're going with the next film.